Hi, welcome to the PropWealth podcast, a series for landlords and property investors of all sizes. I'm Sam Murphy, independent financial advisor and mortgage expert.
And I'm Heather, landlord of Portfolio and also the owner of a sales and lettings agency in Sussex. Now, today we've got another interesting topic. We're going to talk about should we refurb or should we refinance property? And so today, making your property must work hard for you, but you don't want to be spending too much time on the refurb aspect. So let's think about what are tenants actually looking for when they ring after they've seen your advert. What they're actually looking for now is a property, generally, that they can make their home. And despite what everybody says, a lot of tenants stay actually quite a long time in the properties. You know, they're part of the community. They get to know friends. They get to know the people around the local shop. They have a job. And they're very, very aware of what is on offer, because obviously there are lots of properties that they may have lost out on. So as a landlord, we always suggest that you have it in the best condition you possibly could, because presentation is still key.
And what do you find? So if a landlord's putting their property back on the market, obviously everyone wants to spend as little as possible on refurbishing and maintenance and get as much as possible market value. What do you see in the current market? What are the features and the amenities that tenants are really looking for? And what things will put tenants off and make them choose somewhere else?
They do like a property that's been well looked after, as everybody would. I think things like, you know, whether you have carpets or tiles, if the property's clean, it's got good kitchen facilities, good bathroom facilities, not lots of noise from neighbours, but equally that they're close to the amenities that they want. Simple things like broadband. You know, we all spend lots of time on our computers and phones nowadays. So broadband, good Wi-Fi, and also they really do rely on their landlord to respond if there are maintenance issues. I would add a little caveat there, because not all tenants know if there is an issue, which is why midterm inspections are really important to highlight those, because a gentle drip can suddenly turn into a rush of water, and you don't want that. Yeah,
well, it's a two-way street as well, isn't it? You know, sometimes tenants, they'll be worried they'll be causing a fuss, or they draw attention to themselves, and they'll ignore something that, with the benefit of experience, you'll know is actually something that could be quite serious if you've got damp or mold, things like that, because it's a very topical issue with all the news and the terrible issues with some properties. But there are some basic behaviours that, in terms of ventilation, that you need to be mindful of, and older properties especially. You know, you might need that window open in the winter every now and then.
I think it's a bit odd, really, that, you know, we as agents have to provide the tenants with lots of documentation. EPCs, PAT tests, EICRs, and they don't seem too fussed about it, but this is all about their safety in a property. So, you know, making sure that they're all there from the start, and then they are updated during their tenancy. It's almost like sometimes they feel it's a bit of an intrusion that somebody's coming to check the gas safety. But this time of year, when you want the gas to switch on at the right time, is really important.
Yeah, and of course there's a number of reasons why keeping the property in good order is of benefit to the landlord. Everyone, especially with rising interest rates, has been very careful with their cash recently, but you really do just store up problems for the future if you don't keep things looked after. And with what's on the horizon, that's never been more pressing than today.
Well, that's absolutely right. From a compliance perspective, if a landlord doesn't respond within a certain amount of time, you know, there can be complaints made against them. We've got, again, huge fines threatened if certain things aren't carried out. I think also tenants just like their landlord to be upfront with them. There are certain things within the Renters' Rights Act that's going to really make a difference. So, for example, they're only allowed to landlords are only allowed to increase the rent once a year, and the tenant has to agree to it. Otherwise, you could end up in long drawn out discussions about whether it is a comparable rent increase or not, and in between times you're not getting the increased rent. So I think it really does encourage more communication, more honest communication between landlords and tenants, which isn't always easy, which is why sometimes the agents take it on the chin and do the negotiating to see what's possible. You know, for the sake of £5, £10, you don't want a tenant moving out because he doesn't like the increase.
I think you touched on something really important there, actually. So the Renters' Rights Act just come in, still settling down, and various dates for various parts of it coming into force. But one of the features that you referenced there was only being able to increase a rent once a year. And really importantly, the tenant's right to challenge that. So as I understand it, a tenant can challenge the rent increase at no cost to them. So they can go to a tribunal to have their case heard about whether it's a fair increase in rent. Now, we don't know how long that's going to take. Our suspicion is that it's highly under-resourced and people will be waiting months. So you might find tenants just querying those rent increases and asking for a tribunal as a delay tactic because they know it will get them 6 months until it has to come in. So having a good relationship between landlord and tenant becomes incredibly important there, because if the landlord's been responsive, if the landlord's made improvements and the tenant thinks, oh, do you know what, I mean, you know, they're a nice person, they've been responsive, they've done this and that to the property, this seems like a sensible increase. That's going to be really helpful, surely.
It is, but very often landlords, they get to know their tenants. They don't like to increase the rent. And what happens is the rent ends up lower than the market rate, which is why you hear these horror stories of, you know, my landlord suddenly asked me for £600 extra a month because they haven't done it for the last how many years. So as agents, we would always say just increase it a little bit every year, and then you don't fall too far behind. But all this has got to be balanced up about what can the tenant afford, you know, so getting a good reference. Anybody can lose a job after they've been referenced. So again, things like getting rent guarantees and all those sorts of things are absolutely critical. And of course, the problem is with refurbishment in particular, very often they can be expensive. And, you know, it's very simple. Look on your EPC certificate and see what is suggested there. So we're looking at two things here. General good condition of the property, but also what is compliant. So start with the EPC certificate, see where they've suggested it might be light bulbs, it might be secondary glazing, just to get that rating up. And then after that, you know, things are bound to get knocked about sometimes when work is being done. So use that time to then improve the painting, the decorating, and sometimes, you know, it's just simple things that you need to do. You don't need to go over the top. And if you have an annual budget, if you like, for maintenance, well, do that. Don't do everything all at once. And share that with your tenants. Say, look, we're doing this now, we're going to do that later, and we'll do that later on.
Yeah, communication is absolutely key, isn't it? Yeah. You touched on something really important there, I think, as well. And you mentioned in a previous episode that we did about the importance of running your portfolio or your property as a business. And I saw that with a lot of our landlord mortgage clients, enjoying the low interest rates. And obviously over the last 5 years, lots has happened. COVID, was that 5 years ago now? God, time flies. So, yeah, there were always reasons why there was vulnerability and people on hard times. But if you wait until the end of your 5-year fixed mortgage deal to ratchet the rent up because suddenly your payments in many cases for interest-only mortgages double, then that's not fair on the tenant. They would much rather have had a steady incremental increase over the last few years, and it becomes a regular feature then. You know, most tenants don't expect to go into a property and kind of hunker down and think, right, how long can I stick it out here before the rent gets increased? If on the year anniversary every time the rent goes up by 3 to 5%, you know, roughly inflation, especially if it reflects improvements to the property, surely that's fair and that's hard to argue with. Whereas it goes up, you know, 20, 30% after 5 years, they're not expecting that. They think they're getting a reward for being a good tenant, and now they're being punished for forces outside their control.
That's very right, actually, Sam. And I think the problem is once upon a time we were a nation of savers, and now we seem to be a nation of spenders. And I'm afraid my generation saved a lot. There was always some rainy day fund somewhere, and whether you're a landlord or a tenant, having a rainy day fund is really good, because then you've got extra resources to call upon if something suddenly happens that's unexpected. And we all know, recently I've had a shower go in my house. We've had something else happen and something else happen. Before you know it, you're spending out thousands. So in general, if landlords can get costs from a firm of lenders to do some of these repairs, are they reasonable interest rates or not? Or would it be better just to stick it on their credit card and pay it off every month?
Some do. So we strayed off topic a little bit. We were talking about refurb or refinance or both. I think we've established so far the importance of putting the property in as good order as possible. You get happy tenants, you're going to find it easier to let, but they're not free. So for a lot of landlords, the reason they put these off is it's not out of greed, it's out of necessity because of the cash flow. So you'll find a lot of lenders, if you've got a buy-to-let mortgage, or even if you don't, you can approach them and they'll do further advances, or they'll grant a mortgage for home improvements. Lenders are really worried that all their stock on their books is going to fall outside of the energy efficiency requirements in 2030. So if you think of yourself as, BM Solutions, Birmingham Midshire is one of the biggest lenders out there. What happens to them if 30% of the housing stock that they have a mortgage on becomes outside the law and unable to be let? Well, it's bad news for them as well, because if the landlord can't let it, the tenant can't have tenants in there paying rent. So it's really in lenders' interest as well to help landlords on this journey. And you'll see a lot of support material and initiatives from lenders trying to help landlords get to grips with the new requirements. But mortgage finance is generally the cheapest way to do it. I'm not on here to give financial advice, but all the disclaimers we might have to put at the bottom.
Yeah.
But if you can put it on your mortgage, that's generally the cheapest way to do it if you don't have the cash reserves to do it. Obviously, improvements and repairs, improvements can be offset against capital gains tax. Repairs can be offset against income tax when you do your tax return. So whatever costs you incur, you get a little bit of respite in terms of the tax position of doing so. You keep on top of the law and you make your property more marketable. So I think lender first if you haven't got the cash in the bank. And if you haven't heard from your lender, talk to an independent advisor or approach your lender directly and see if they're offering any incentives to help landlords with these difficult upgrades that are on the horizon.
I think that's great advice. If you don't ask, you won't know, will you?
No, exactly. And I'm curious, you hear all these nightmares about these properties that are just neglected and not kept up to standard. When you get a tenancy change, I don't know if you have many landlords who don't do as much as they should or could to their properties, but if you put a property back to market and it's not in good condition, it's in the bottom sort of 10-15% of quality, what challenges does that present you with as an agent? Do you find you can still find tenants? Is it all about the price and people will put up with anything if it's cheap enough?
Well, no, because before we rent out a property, we carry out risk assessments, and the housing health, for example, we have to look at all that, which all leads into the decent home standard. So we are not being truthful agents if we allowed a home property to be rented out when it doesn't meet these regulations, because all you need is for the tenants to go to the council and say, we've got issues with this wasn't done, this wasn't done. And it's, if we go back to the documentation at the beginning, if those weren't handed out properly, then the landlord could end up paying 3 times the rent that he's already received. So it really pays to know what's happening with the property. Some landlords never visit the property because they're either overseas or they live a long way away, but that's why they rely on us to go round and do a site visit, property visit, to make sure everything's okay. So even checking under the sink to make sure there's no water dripping, that's happened before. Tenants haven't noticed, and before you know it, it's going down to the flat below and you end up with £1,000 of damage, or calling on your insurance company.
And I think the bar's being raised with quality as well, because we're seeing so many of these big new apartment blocks going up that are built solely as rental properties, so built by the life insurance companies, for example, or big property investors. And so they're now putting a huge amount of stock. I mean, I'm in Hove, and within a mile of my home, there's a couple of big developments with hundreds and hundreds of units, all for rental, all at a real top dollar price. But you've got concierge, you've got a dining room you can hire, you've got a cinema room you can hire. So, there is a market for people paying premium prices. So as a landlord, I feel like, you can still undercut that as a price point, and it doesn't have to be hugely expensive to keep a property, just to keep on top of things.
I think sometimes we forget that it's not just studio flats that are rented out. There are these mega properties that are hired out as well, and it's like, just know your market. Who would come in and rent a big 4-bedroom property in one of the suburban areas of Brighton and Hove? Who's looking for a quick studio flat because they're only intending to work there 6 months, a year maybe? And it's like anything in life, you have to know who your market is. Do they want it furnished or unfurnished? Do they want air fryers? Air fryers. I'm fine with a good old microwave, but so these are the sorts of things that you could get really involved with, but everybody seems to want to blame landlords, where a lot of them are really, really good. They look after their properties, they look after their tenants, and I think it's just the bad landlords that bring a bad name to everything.
Yeah, they grab the attention, don't they?
They do grab the attention.
So I think know your market there is the key message. That,
know your client, yes.
Yeah, if you were letting to students, you'd do
Exactly.
things slightly differently. So think who's going to rent that property, and stay on top of the rules. And even if you don't have the cash in your pocket, it's worth trying to find it, because you'll let it easier. You'll stay on top of the rules, and hopefully life is less stressful as a landlord then.
That's right, absolutely.
Good. Well, that's all for this episode. So thanks for joining us. If you've got any questions or comments, please do put them in the comment section below, and we'll look forward to seeing you for the next episode.